All right, so get that they were stepping right into a room jam-packed with some serious brain power for this deep dive. Imagine a late-night panel discussion, but with Neil deGrasse Tyson, Andrew Sullivan, and Donna Brazile. Yeah, that's where we're headed.
Not your typical research paper for sure. This panel discussion goes everywhere. Asteroid threats and space exploration, and even jumps into the possibility of a female president. Then even dives into election statistics, too.
Well, let's start with planetary defense. You know Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's our astrophysicist extraordinaire. Well, he is sounding the alarm on asteroid detection. And he makes this really striking analogy.
Yeah, he compares early asteroid detection to cancer screening. He emphasizes that time is really critical in both cases. You know, just like catching a tumor early increases the chances of survival. Spotting an asteroid early gives us more time to come up with the good defense.
And, he didn't just talk about it. He took this concern straight to the head of the Space Force, advocating for asteroid defense.
That's a pretty impactful story. It shows that he's not just theorizing about these things, but actually pushing for action. And it also shows how these far-out scenarios can actually shape real policy decisions.
Then we have Andrew Sullivan jumping in with his typical wit. He suggests that the best way to motivate a U.S. mission to Mars is for China to leak a memo about putting a military base there.
It's funny, but it also kind of reveals a truth about space exploration. It's not always about scientific curiosity or the pursuit of knowledge. It's often about geopolitics and competition, too.
Tyson brings us back down to earth a bit, though, by reminding us that space exploration is almost always driven by these geopolitical factors, not just the thrill of discovery.
Now let's change gears to a different prediction about the future. Donna Brazile confidently says that we will see a Democratic female president in her lifetime.
That's a bold statement. And it sparks this debate with Sullivan. He points out that a lot of powerful female leaders around the world has actually come from the right.
Yeah.
People like Margaret Thatcher and Angela Merkel.
And then they even joke about what names to avoid for a female vice president. Apparently, anything that sounds like Tim is off the table.
But underneath all the banter, there's a more serious discussion about how we perceive women as leaders. Sullivan uses the term hard-ass women and suggests that there's an expectation of toughness, maybe even aggression, from women in power.
It makes you think about the double standards women often face in politics. Do they have to project a certain image to be taken seriously? How are these expectations different for male leaders?
Their conversation about Kamala Harris and the pushback on her campaign in 2024 brings this point into focus. Sullivan argues that there wasn't a model for the situation she was in, like being the potential successor to an aging president.
This makes you think about the unique challenges someone like her might face, and if those were really considered fairly when people were evaluating her.
And just when you think it can't get any more wide-ranging, Tyson says that humans are just bad at statistics. Our brains just aren't made for it.
He even says that the idea of averaging numbers didn't come about until after calculus was invented. It makes you wonder how much our limited grasp of probability is affecting our everyday choices.
Then he uses this to start a debate about vaccine hesitancy, and he takes a strong pro-vaccine stance. But on the other hand, Sullivan is a bit more skeptical about medical interventions. He questions their effectiveness and also the potential problems.
Yeah, it's a clash of worldviews, right? Tyson is focused on scientific consensus and the good of everyone, and Sullivan leans more towards individual choice and questioning authority.
And their back and forth is really funny. At one point, Tyson tells Sullivan, "You're the guy who doesn't understand why the NBA team can't beat the Lakers?"
It's a lighthearted jab, but it also makes a serious point. Even brilliant people can struggle with statistics, and this can have real consequences, especially when it comes to public health.
And Tyson ends this by comparing vaccines to a social contract. It's not just about you, it's about contributing to the health and safety of everyone.
Yeah, this is a thought-provoking idea, especially today when what we do can affect so many other people, whether we mean it to or not. Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about human psychology and risk. Tyson argues that this human struggle with statistics actually affects how we deal with everything, from vaccines to that asteroid impact.
But it's not just asteroids and vaccines, right? Remember what he said about casinos?
Yep.
They're built on that blind spot we have for probability.
Right. And that brings us to another interesting part of the conversation. They turn to political trends and also election statistics. They're picking apart voting patterns for specific groups, like the LGBTQ plus community, and also Jewish voters. It gets pretty interesting, with percentages being thrown around and, of course, a lot of debate about how accurate these polls are.
It seemed like they were all over the place. trying to understand all that data and what it means for the future of American politics.
I thought Sullivan's point about the problems with grouping everyone as LGBTQ+ was really insightful. He says it hides the important differences inside those communities.
He specifically challenged the idea that all LGBTQ+ voters would vote Democrat, saying that a big chunk of that population is bisexual women, and many of them might be with men. It's a good reminder that even simple statistics can be misleading if you don't consider the different viewpoints inside any group.
And just when things are getting really heavy, Tyson says one of his classic lines, "Go her on Uranus." I mean, even when talking about tough and controversial issues, he throws in humor to keep it fun.
For sure. Speaking of controversial, the conversation shifts to Ellen DeGeneres' decision to move to England after the 2024 election. This is right after the accusations about her work environment, right?
Yeah, and the panel actually uses Ellen's story to jump into broader trends, like political polarization and self-imposed exile. It's almost like they're using her to show the cultural divides in society.
Sullivan makes this really interesting point. He says that Ellen was essentially canceled by the left for the way she supposedly acted at work. But then she leaves the country because the right wins. It's a strange case study. It's about feeling alienated from both sides.
Yeah, it suggests that sometimes it's not just one side that makes you feel disillusioned. It could be a lot of things that make you feel like you don't belong.
Tyson, always the pragmatist, points out that for someone as rich as Ellen, any place is good. I mean, it's a reminder that money can protect you from the bad things that happen in politics, something that most of us can only dream of.
And this brings them to a broader point. They start talking about economic inequality, the huge difference in experiences between the super rich and everyone else. It's like they're realizing the limits of their own viewpoints. I mean, they are pretty high-profile figures.
And before they wrap up, they talk about one last thing, Elon Musk, and whether we can really send humans to Mars.
Yeah, and this is where Tyson's expertise on space comes in. He says that big space projects like going to Mars aren't usually just about science.
He says that they're almost always driven by geopolitics. Things like trying to stay ahead of China, or being the most powerful in space.
Right. And Sullivan, always the provocateur, suggests that the fastest way to get the U.S. to Mars is if China leaked a fake memo about building military bases up there.
I mean, he's joking, but it makes you think about the worries of another space race and how far countries might go to show their power beyond Earth.
Tyson pushes back a little, though. He points out how huge and complicated a Mars mission is. It would need a ton of money and political support, more than we can even imagine right now. But then he says something really interesting. Somebody has to pay for it. Almost like he's saying, maybe a private citizen like Elon Musk, with all his money and drive, could actually make this impossible dream happen.
This panel has talked about so much, from asteroids and elections to what it means to be human. And there's still more to unpack. So we've gone from outer space all the way to human behavior, and now it's time to put it all together. What did we learn from this panel discussion?
We've talked about asteroid threats, how female leadership is changing, and even Ellen DeGeneres moving across the Atlantic. But running through all of that are these themes about human nature, how we see risk, and the forces that shape our world.
One thing that really stuck with me was Tyson saying that humans are just naturally bad at statistics. Our brains aren't built for it. Makes you wonder how much of what we do is based on gut feelings instead of facts.
Yeah, and that's really important today, right? We're flooded with statistics everywhere. News headlines, social media. We really need to be able to think critically and see the difference between real data and emotional appeals.
It's almost like we need a crash course in statistics just to get by in life.
And that ties back into the whole vaccine thing. Tyson said getting vaccinated is like a social contract. Not just about protecting ourselves, but about the well-being of everyone. It makes you think about individual freedom versus our responsibility to the community.
Yeah, and that idea of our choices affecting others came up a lot. Whether it's wearing a mask during a pandemic or supporting policies on climate change, what we do has consequences beyond just ourselves.
Right, even personal choices like Ellen moving to England reflect these bigger trends. Growing political divides and people feeling disillusioned no matter what side they're on.
This panel was like a mini version of the world we live in. Complicated, messy, full of contradictions. But even with all the debates and disagreements, there were funny moments, real connections, and a shared sense of wonder.
And that's what makes these conversations so important. They remind us that even with all the challenges, there's still room for being curious, open-minded, and even having a laugh.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. Think back to everything we've talked about: asteroids, elections, vaccines, Elon's big move.
Now ask yourself, how much of what you know about these things is based on real evidence?
Well-
And how much is shaped by your own biases, your gut reactions, or even just the way your brain works?
It's a question worth thinking about. The answers might surprise you. And maybe, just maybe, that's where real change starts. When we're willing to question what we think we know, challenge our biases, and accept that we all have a lot to learn.